I still remember the clink of silverware, the low hum of voices, the scent of rosemary and roast beef in the air. The banquet hall was warm with light and laughter, but I felt like I was standing in the middle of a winter storm. It was my niece's engagement party, a grand one, hosted at a military club in the heart of the city. My brother, Thomas, had pulled every string, invited every name. He always had a flair for these things. Former colonels, CEOs, local officials, people I'd only ever seen in the newspapers, all mingled like old friends under golden chandeliers. I wore a plain navy dress. My shoes were a little scuffed, and I had done my makeup twice because my hands shook the first time. Still, I thought I looked decent, presentable, at least. I had driven 4 hours to be there. Not that anyone noticed. Not Thomas. He stood near the head of the room, tall and booming as ever, holding court with a whiskey in one hand and the other tucked into his blazer pocket. His voice carried, as it always did, polished, commanding, theatrical. He told stories like a general retelling his victories, always at the center, always the hero. And then he saw me. "Ah, there she is," he called, gesturing toward me with a lazy swing of his glass. Heads turned. Conversations paused. My big sister, the wandering spirit of the family. Can you believe she made it? First time in what? A decade. There was polite laughter. I forced a smile, walking slowly into the spotlight he'd cast. Thomas didn't stop. "You all remember Clara, right?" he said, like I was a trivia question. "The one who moved to the middle of nowhere to, what was it? Grow lavender and talk to chickens." More laughter. I froze in place. The back of my neck burned. I looked at my hands to hide the tremble in them. He laughed again, not cruelly, not angrily, just like someone who found his own joke far too amusing. And the thing is, that was always his way. Charming, effortless, dangerous. He could slice you open with a smile on his face. I excused myself before dessert. No one followed. Later, in the dimness of the powder room, I stared at myself in the mirror. My lipstick had smudged. My eyes were wet, though I hadn't cried yet. It wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the remembering. The nights I had stayed up with Mom during her illness, while Thomas traveled for work. The sacrifices I made dropping out of nursing school, returning home to care for her, selling Dad's watch to pay off one of her medical bills. I don't tell people that. And when she passed, Thomas arranged the funeral like it was a business meeting, shook hands, gave a eulogy he'd written on the plane, then left. I stayed. I packed her clothes, emptied the house, cleaned the floors by hand. He never asked how I was holding up. I thought about leaving the party entirely. I even walked toward the coat room, ready to call a cab and drive all the way back home in silence. But then I saw him. The general. Well, that's what everyone called him. Retired, I think, but still looked the part. Broad shoulders, neat gray hair, and those eyes that had seen too much and didn't need to say so. He was sitting alone near the back of the hall, sipping tea instead of wine. I must have walked past too quickly, because he looked up and said gently, "Leaving already?" I froze, startled. "Yes, sir. It's getting late." He looked at his watch. "It's not yet 9. I gave a small laugh, the kind you make when you don't know what else to do. I suppose I wasn't made for these sorts of events. He nodded thoughtfully. Then he said something that made me stop breathing for a moment. "Your brother speaks often, but he doesn't always speak well." I turned slowly, unsure if I'd heard him right. "Excuse me," he gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Please, sit. I've found that people who leave early often have the best stories." I hesitated, then sat. And just like that, for the first time that night, someone saw me. The general didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. He spoke in quiet rhythms, like he was thinking out loud more than trying to impress. He told me about soldiers he'd trained, people he'd buried, regrets he carried like medals no one ever pinned on him, and somewhere between stories. I told him mine. I told him about the family farm, about lavender fields and frost-bitten mornings, about losing Mom and losing myself, about how it felt when the only person who knew your heart was gone and all that was left was a brother who remembered you as a punchline. I didn't cry, but I looked down at my lap a lot. He listened. Every word. No interruptions. No jokes. And when I was done, he looked me in the eye and said, "You stayed. That counts more than you know." Just 6 words. "You stayed. That counts more than you know." I nodded. Slowly. A warmth spread across my chest. Not joy, not even relief, but something older, quieter. Like I'd been given permission to stop carrying shame that wasn't mine. He finished his tea, stood up, and added, "Don't mistake silence for weakness. The loudest ones often hide the most fear." He gave a small bow and walked away before I could thank him. I didn't leave the party that night. I didn't confront Thomas either. I just returned, sat quietly, smiled when people looked. I held the general's words close to my chest like a charm stitched into the lining of my coat. And when the photographer came around for a family photo, I stood tall. Not for him. For me. Funny, isn't it? How sometimes it takes a stranger to remind you who you are. Not the labels, not the failures, not the wounds your own family gave you when they weren't paying attention, but who you really are. Beneath it all, the one who stayed, the one who kept going, even when no one applauded. Have you ever experienced a moment like this, when someone finally saw you after years of feeling invisible? I'd truly love to know. Feel free to share your story in the comments below. The drive home that night felt different. Usually, after family events like that, I'd leave with a weight in my chest, a familiar dull ache that settled into the corners of my body like an old injury. I'd replay every word, every moment, wondering what I could have done to make it feel less lonely. But not this time. That night, with the road stretched before me and the stars above, I just drove. The general's words kept echoing. "You stayed. That counts more than you know." It was simple, gentle, unpolished, but something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just offering comfort, but delivering a truth, made it hard to forget. I passed the same old highway signs, the same quiet towns, the same blinking gas stations, but inside me, something had shifted. When I got back to the house, my little place outside town, the porch light I'd forgotten to turn off still burned softly. The lavender bushes I'd planted years ago swayed gently in the wind, even in the dark. It was quiet, safe, mine. I put the kettle on and changed into pajamas. And for the first time in a long time, I sat by the window and let the silence hold me without shame. The next morning, I woke up with a thought I couldn't shake. I went to the hallway closet and pulled out an old box, one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were photo albums, letters, things from Mom I hadn't been ready to face until now. There was a card she'd written me when I turned 30. Her handwriting was soft and a little shaky. To my Clara, "You've always had a quiet strength. I see it, even when others don't. Love, Mom." I ran my fingers over the ink. That word again. Strength. Quiet strength. Funny how we forget that silence can be powerful, that not everyone needs to shout to be strong. Sometimes, staying is the most radical thing a person can do. Staying kind, staying soft, staying present even when you're overlooked. A week later, I got a call. It was Thomas. He rarely called, mostly texted. And even then, only when it concerned birthdays or bank transfers. I answered with hesitation. Clara, he said, voice low, almost careful. Hey, I hope you got home safe. There was a pause. Not awkward, just empty. Like he didn't know how to start. I just wanted to say. He went on. If I said anything, off, at the party, I didn't mean it that way. It was just jokes. You know, everyone was in good spirits. I closed my eyes and let him speak. I didn't mean to embarrass you or anything. You know how I am. I thought you might have laughed. I didn't say anything right away. For once, I didn't rush in to make him feel better. Eventually, I said, I know that's how you are. That's kind of the problem. Another pause. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. I know, I said, honestly, but that doesn't mean you didn't. He was quiet after that. I think part of him expected me to brush it off, to be the easygoing one again, but I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I was just done performing. That weekend, I spent time in the garden, dug my fingers into the soil, watered the roots I'd planted years ago, back when I moved here and didn't know who I was without the family home, without Mom, without a role to play. Back then, I felt like I had run away. Now, I see it differently. I didn't run. I returned to myself. That same Sunday, I went into town for the farmer's market. I sold bundles of dried lavender and handmade soaps. Same as always. But this time, I let myself linger in conversation, smiled a little longer, let people see me. There was an older woman, Darlene. I think her name was, who came up and held a bar of soap to her nose. This reminds me of my grandmother's backyard, she said, eyes twinkling. You must put love into these. And I said something I hadn't said before. I do. That's why they grow. She patted my hand. That's why you grow too, dear. I don't know what made her say it. Maybe she didn't even mean it deeply, but it felt like a thread tying me back to the General's words, to Mom's letter, to all the quiet things that built me when no one was watching. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail, a real letter. No return address. Inside was a folded note written in neat, careful handwriting. You deserved better. And I saw that. I'm glad you stayed that night. The General. I held the paper to my chest and smiled. You see, people think stories of strength are about battles, about loud victories and big gestures, but sometimes they're about choosing to show up anyway, even when you're afraid, even when you've been dismissed, even when your own brother mocks you in front of a room full of strangers. You show up, you stay, you remember who you are, and sometimes, if you're lucky, someone else sees it too and says it out loud, just when you need it most. Since then, I've made small changes. I started writing again, just little journal entries at first, then letters to Mom, then to myself. I joined a book club in town. I repainted the kitchen. I even let myself buy a nicer pair of shoes, not because I needed them, but because I wanted to feel like I was walking into my life, not just through it. And I've been thinking, maybe I'll write a story one day, not about Thomas, not about the party, but about a woman who thought she was forgotten until someone reminded her she mattered. Maybe that's all it takes. One person, one moment, one sentence that sticks to your ribs and carries you forward. 3 weeks after the party, Thomas sent me a photo. It popped up in my messages late one afternoon while I was out watering the front garden. At first, I didn't even recognize the number. He wasn't one to message unless it was about family arrangements. But when I opened it, there it was, a group photo from the engagement party. All of us standing together in a loose line, Thomas in the center, smiling with his arm around his daughter, his wife, elegant as ever in a green dress, and me, off to the side in navy blue, hands clasped politely in front of me, a quiet smile on my face. His message was short. "You looked nice that night. Thought you should have a copy." I stood there for a long time, phone in hand, staring at that photo. Not because of the image, but because for the first time in years, Thomas saw fit to send me something with no joke attached. No backhanded tone, no ask, just a photo. And a small kindness. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. And something was more than nothing. Still, I didn't reply right away. I needed time. I'd spent years shrinking myself to fit the quiet corners of my family's gatherings. Now, I needed to make sure I wasn't stepping back into old habits, the ones where I softened every edge of his behavior just to keep the peace. So instead of texting back, I printed the photo and framed it, not for sentimental reasons, but to remind myself I was there. I showed up. I belonged in that room, even if no one knew how to welcome me properly. A few days later, I visited Mom's grave. It had been a while. Too long. Maybe. The stone was dusted with spring pollen and a few early dandelions. I knelt beside it, brushing the petals away, and placed a small bundle of lavender at the base. I went to the party. I whispered, brushing the grass with my fingers. "You would have hated it. All that small talk. But you would have worn your pearls and smiled for the photos." The wind was soft that day, and the sun filtered through the trees in quiet patterns. I sat with her for a while, not talking, just remembering. Her hands, her voice, the way she used to tilt her head when she was listening closely. "I think I'm okay now," I said finally, and I meant it. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in over 15 years. I invited someone over. Margaret, a neighbor from 2 houses down, had always waved when she walked her dog past my fence. We'd exchanged pleasantries for years, but never more than that. I knew her husband had passed away a decade ago. I knew she made a good apple crumble, but I didn't know her. Not really. So I wrote her a note. Simple, handwritten, and slipped it in her mailbox. "Would you like to come by for tea one day this week? I'm trying something new. Company?" She came over that Thursday, brought scones. We sat on the porch with mismatched mugs and a pot of Earl Grey, talked about little things, weather, books, dogs, laughed at nothing in particular. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You've got a nice calm about you, Clara, like someone who's seen storms but chooses not to talk about them." I smiled. "There were storms," I said softly, "but they passed." She nodded. "They always do. The question is, who are we after they pass?" After Margaret left, I sat with her words. Who are we after the storm? It's a question I'd never really asked myself, not out loud. I had always lived in response to things, responding to Thomas, to family needs, to silence, to absence. Even my move here had felt like a response. But what if, now, I could live from something inside me, not just from reaction, but from choice? The next morning, I wrote Thomas back. "Thank you for the photo. I'm glad I came. I hope Lily's engagement goes smoothly." She looked happy. No extra words, no emotional labor, just honest, kind, and clear. He replied 3 hours later. "She was glad you were there. Said you made the whole room smell like spring. Guess that lavender clung to your dress. In a good way." I smiled. Sometimes, small things carry weight, even offhanded compliments about your scent, especially when they come from someone who once only remembered you by your failures. One night, not long after, I sat outside under the stars, a blanket over my legs, sipping tea. I thought about the general again, how his presence had been so still, so steady, how he had said so little but left such a mark. I wondered if he had daughters, if he had family, if he had ever felt small in a room full of people who should have known better. I still had his note tucked in my journal drawer. You deserved better. And I saw that. I read it now and then. Not to dwell, but to remind myself of what's possible, because sometimes we spend years carrying wounds that no one acknowledges, until one person, one stranger says something kind at the right time and stitches us back together in ways we didn't expect, and we heal. Not all at once, but piece by piece. It's strange, the kind of strength that grows in silence. It doesn't look like armor. It doesn't roar. It doesn't march into rooms and demand to be seen. It grows quietly, in lavender fields, in handwritten letters, in cups of tea shared on porches, in the choice to show up, even when no one says thank you. That's the kind of strength I've learned to respect. And maybe, just maybe, it's the kind the world needs more of. Spring melted into early summer, and my world, once small, once quiet to the point of vanishing, began to shift in soft, steady ways. It started with the lavender. Each year, I always harvested just enough for the soaps and sachets I sold at the weekend markets. But this year, the plants seemed fuller, richer, as if something in the soil had finally settled. I found myself tending to them not just as a chore, but as a kind of ritual. I whispered to them sometimes while I worked. Maybe they listened. Maybe they remembered everything I had whispered when I was hurting. One afternoon, while trimming the overgrowth along the back fence, I heard the crunch of gravel on my driveway. I wiped my brow and peered through the sunlight. It was Lily, Thomas's daughter. She stepped out of her little green car, holding a small box wrapped in newspaper. Her hair was tied back in a loose braid, and she looked both nervous and determined, a look I recognized all too well. "Aunt Clara," she said, stepping closer. "Can I sit with you a while?" I nodded, motioning toward the porch. "Of course, sweetheart." We sat in the old wicker chairs, the ones Mom used to rock in when she had something on her mind, but didn't want to speak first. I waited. Lily held the box in her lap like it might break if she moved too quickly. After a moment, she spoke. "Dad told me what happened. At the party." I blinked. "He did." She nodded. Not in detail. Just that he realized afterward that he'd crossed a line, that you were hurt, and that he wasn't proud of himself. That last part surprised me. I didn't think Thomas was the kind of man who confessed shame, even to himself. Lily placed the box between us and opened it. Inside were dozens of old photos, some faded, some curling at the edges. I leaned in closer and gasped quietly. There we were, Thomas and me, as children, with Mom, with Dad, picnics, birthdays. Even that one photo of the two of us dressed up like cowboys, fists raised in mock duels. "Dad's been cleaning out the attic," Lily said. "He asked me to digitize everything, but he said these he wanted you to have." I picked one up carefully. It was my 5th birthday. I was grinning with a missing front tooth, holding a cake in one hand, Thomas in the other. I'd forgotten that photo even existed. I didn't know he still had these. I whispered. Lily looked at me, then really looked. Neither did I. We sat in silence, thumbing through the past. Then, in a soft voice, she added, "I think he's trying, in his own clumsy way." I nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can forgive everything," I admitted. "You don't have to," she said. "But maybe you can let him meet you halfway." I smiled at her, this young woman, full of grace and courage, who'd somehow become a bridge between two islands. After she left, I spent the evening laying the photos out on the table. The light from the windows turned gold as it passed through the trees, touching each memory with a softness I hadn't felt in years. Some photos made me smile, Some stung. Some felt like looking into a life that belonged to someone else entirely, but they were all mine. The next weekend, I took a deep breath and did something unexpected. I invited Thomas to my home. Just him. No wives. No ceremony. No spotlight. I kept the message simple. Come by Sunday afternoon if you're free. Tea's at 4. I'd like to talk. He didn't reply for a day and a half. And then, just 5 words. I'll be there. Thank you. Sunday came, and I set the table with 2 chipped mugs, a plate of almond cookies, and a vase of fresh lavender from the garden. I wasn't trying to impress. I just wanted it to feel real. He arrived exactly at 4, wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, looked older than I remembered, more tired around the eyes. We didn't hug, but we smiled. That was enough. We sat outside, under the same tree where I'd once buried a tiny time capsule as a child. At first, it was small talk weather, Lily's wedding plans, the market. But eventually, the silence between us changed shape. It stopped being awkward. It became permission. So I spoke. I want to tell you something, I said, hands wrapped around my mug. At the party, when you joked about me, it hurt. Not just because it was public, but because it felt like you still only saw the girl who left, the one who failed. Thomas looked down, nodded, said nothing. I've done a lot of healing. I continued. Alone. Quietly. And maybe that's why no one noticed. But I need you to know I'm not that girl anymore. I haven't been for a long time. He cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was softer than I'd ever heard it. I don't know why I did it, he said. Maybe it was habit. Maybe I was trying to be funny. Maybe I was jealous. I blinked. Jealous. He nodded. You had the courage to walk away, to live life on your terms. I stayed. I climbed ladders, wore the suits, shook hands. But sometimes, I look in the mirror and don't even know who I became. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. And suddenly, I didn't feel small anymore. Not invisible. Not the quiet sister who got laughed at. I felt seen. I reached out and poured him another cup of tea. We didn't fix everything that day. We didn't need to. But we began something. Something quieter than reconciliation. Something deeper than forgiveness. Recognition. When he left, he stood by his car for a long time before turning to me. I don't say this enough, he said, voice rough. But I'm proud of you. Clara? I nodded. I know. It took years to get here. Years of hurt, of silence, of swallowing the sharp things to keep the peace. But sometimes, healing doesn't come in grand apologies. It comes in cups of tea, in framed photos, in a quiet man finally saying what he should have said decades ago, and in a woman who stopped waiting and started choosing. The summer days stretched long and slow after that Sunday. Not much changed in the way the world looked. The trees still rustled in the same wind. The mail still came late on Mondays, and the market stall still needed setting up every Saturday morning. But inside me, something was different. Something had settled. There was no explosion of forgiveness between me and Thomas. No dramatic reconciliation like you see in movies where people cry and embrace in the rain. No, what happened between us was much quieter than that. He began writing. Small things, at first postcards. Notes in his slanted, almost childlike handwriting. One came a week after our tea. Planted herbs in the yard. Thought of you. Do lavender roots spread far? I replied the next morning. Only if you let them. But once they take hold, they're hard to move. And so it went. We started communicating like pen pals, like siblings who had grown up too fast and were learning each other again. this time without Mom's shadow or the weight of old rolls. One letter, I keep it in my recipe drawer, simply read, "I wish I'd known how lonely you were." I was too loud to hear it. That was the first time I cried. Not because of guilt, but because it felt like the past had finally loosened its grip around my throat. One afternoon in July, I found myself going through the old chest in the attic again, the one with all the keepsakes I never had the heart to toss. There was a small journal inside, one Mom used to write in when she wasn't feeling well. Nothing dramatic, just short entries, recipes, notes about the garden, thoughts about us. I found one entry, dated just before her last hospital stay. "Thomas will always be the voice. Clara, the heart. I worry sometimes the world won't hear her, but she feels everything the rest of us miss." I read it 3 times. That sentence stayed with me. She feels everything the rest of us miss. I finally understood why silence always hurt me more than it should, why a joke from my brother could bruise deeper than it seemed to warrant. I had always been the one listening too closely, noticing too much, holding the invisible weight of everyone else's emotions, and the world, loud and rushing, didn't make much space for people like me. But the garden did, and letters did, and tea on the porch with people who looked you in the eye that did too. In August, Lily's wedding came. I wasn't sure if I would attend, not because of nerves this time, but because I was learning to check in with myself before agreeing to things, learning to ask, do I truly want to be there? Or am I just afraid not to go? In the end, I chose to go. But I went on my own terms. I wore a dusty lilac dress. No one else's choice. No last-minute texts asking for approval. I did my hair in the soft waves Mom used to wear. I carried a lavender sachet in my clutch. The venue was beautiful, a lake house surrounded by tall trees and soft candlelight. Everything was bathed in sunset gold. It looked like something out of a dream. As I stepped onto the back patio, where guests were mingling before the ceremony, I saw Thomas talking with an old army friend. He noticed me and lifted his hand in a small wave. He didn't call attention. He didn't make a joke. He just smiled. And for the first time in my life, I smiled back and didn't feel a single flicker of doubt about who I was. The ceremony was lovely. Lily walked down the aisle to soft piano music, her face glowing with that unmistakable blend of nerves and joy. At the reception, I sat at a table near the edge of the dance floor, beside a woman named Janice, who crocheted tiny lace favors for all the guests. She said she knew me, remembered me from long ago, when I used to run barefoot around the family home, always with a book in hand. "You were the thoughtful one," she said, "always off to the side, but always watching." I smiled. I'd heard that before. I excused myself for some air, stepped outside, and stood at the edge of the lake. The water was still. The reflection of the lanterns shimmered gently. That's when I felt someone beside me. It was Thomas. He didn't speak at first, just stood next to me, like we were 2 kids again, watching ducks glide past the reeds in the yard. "I was thinking about Mom," he said finally. "Me too. She would have loved this day." I nodded. She would have fixed Lily's hair even if the stylist already had, and made one of her famous punch recipes. He chuckled. And then, almost too quietly to hear I was hard on you, "Clara, it wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no apologies laid out like confessions, just that one sentence, and that was enough." We stood there in silence. This time, it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me something, a folded sheet of paper. I opened it. It was a photo. A copy of the one he'd sent digitally weeks ago, the one from the party. But on the back, he had written, "I used to think you left us. Now I know you saved yourself. And maybe that saved me too." I pressed the photo to my heart. Sometimes, healing is slow. Sometimes, it takes decades. And sometimes, it arrives all at once in a moment beside a lake, with soft light and a brother's quiet admission. We went back inside together. Lily was dancing with her new husband. The room buzzed with soft music, clinking glasses, gentle laughter. Thomas turned to me as the band shifted into a slow song. "Do you remember how to dance?" he asked. "I remember enough." He offered his arm. I took it. And we danced. Not as the loud one and the forgotten one, but as siblings. Whole. Seen. That night, as I drove home through the stillness, I felt a strange peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting the past, but the kind that comes from surviving it and choosing to walk forward anyway. I thought of the general again. How one stranger's words started something I hadn't realized I needed. "You stayed. That counts more than you know." And now I wasn't just staying. I was living. The weeks after Lily's wedding moved like warm honey. Life didn't become perfect. No fairy tale ending. No golden flood of apologies from people who'd once overlooked me. But I no longer needed that. I had stopped waiting for people to make it right. Because something inside me had shifted. I had made peace with the past not by forgetting it, but by understanding the shape it carved into me. One afternoon in late September, I was working in the garden when I heard footsteps on the gravel again. I turned, expecting to see Margaret or the postman, but it wasn't either of them. It was the general. He looked just as I remembered. Straight-backed, pressed shirt, that same quiet strength around the eyes. He wore no medals, no formal air, just the presence of a man who had seen much, said little, and remembered what mattered. I blinked, unsure if I was dreaming. "Hope this isn't a bad time," he said. I wiped my hands on my apron, smiling. Not at all. He stepped closer, looking around at the rows of lavender, the patches of herbs, the old rocking chairs on the porch. "Beautiful," he murmured. "The kind of place a person builds after surviving something." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note, and beneath it, a neatly folded clipping, a short article from a military magazine. The article was titled, "The Quietest Leader in the Room." It told the story of a woman unnamed who had been mocked at a banquet. A woman who had stayed, listened, and showed grace in the face of humiliation. And how that act, though small and silent, had reminded a general of what true courage looked like. I read it once, then again. My hands trembled a little. "You wrote this?" I asked softly. He nodded. "I write a column from time to time. Thought it was worth putting to page." I swallowed hard. "You didn't have to do that." He smiled. "But I wanted to. People forget that silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's full of the strongest things." We sat for a while on the porch, two souls who didn't need many words. I offered him tea. He accepted. He told me about his granddaughter, a pianist, about his late wife, who had loved bees and baked the best honey cake, about how he didn't visit people much anymore, but he had wanted to see how the story ended. I looked out at the lavender, swaying gently. "It didn't end," I said. "It just changed direction." That evening, after he left, I read the article again. There was a sentence near the end that caught me differently the second time. "Some people are not the stars of their families. They are the soil steady, unseen, nourishing everything in silence." I thought about all the years I'd spent feeling like I didn't matter. Not loud enough, not ambitious enough, not bright enough to be noticed. And yet, there had been birthdays remembered, bills paid without mention, quiet dinners prepared, hands held during grief, soil work, and maybe that mattered more than I'd ever allowed myself to believe. Autumn came in slow breaths. The market season wound down. The trees outside turned a deep gold. The porch creaked more often in the wind. Thomas visited again, this time with a small potted rosemary plant in hand. "Saw it and thought of you," he said, sheepish. I took it with a smile, trying to compete with my lavender now. He laughed. "Not a chance." He stayed for dinner, a simple stew, warm bread, apple slices with cinnamon, nothing fancy. But we talked like we hadn't in years, not as strangers forced together by blood, but as two people finally learning who the other had become. He didn't fill every silence with words. I didn't flinch when he did. He asked about Mom. I shared her journal. He cried. We hugged when he left. For the first time, it felt real. One quiet evening, I sat with my journal, the one I'd started writing in after the party, and opened to a blank page. I wrote, "Sometimes, it's not that people don't love you, they just never learned how to love you in your language, and when they finally do, everything softens." I closed the book, placed it on the table, and watched the last light of the day stretch across the floor. Looking back, it's strange how much power that night at the party held, not because of the mockery, not because of the wound, but because of what it revealed. Sometimes, it takes one moment, one cruel laugh, one look of pity, one dismissive joke to push you back into yourself. And sometimes, it takes one voice, one stranger who sees you to pull you out again. The general didn't save me. He reminded me I didn't need saving. I just needed to be recognized. And in the weeks and months that followed, I did something I hadn't dared do before. I began recognizing myself in every quiet choice, in every kindness I gave without asking for one back, in every time I stayed, listened, softened, when it would have been easier to disappear or lash out. That was my strength. It always had been. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly. Because this story, my story, is not just about pain or healing. It's about all the small, invisible people who do the quiet work of holding things together. The ones who never get thanked. The ones who are mocked for being gentle. The ones who grow lavender instead of building empires. You matter. You count. And if no one said that to you yet, let me be the one you stayed. That counts more than you know. Has someone ever reminded you of your worth when you needed it most? Even if you didn't ask for it? If you'd like to share, your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Winter came early that year. Frost curled along the windows by mid-November, and the lavender bushes curled into themselves beneath layers of old quilts and mulch. I didn't mind the cold. There was something comforting about it, the way it slowed everything down, made the world a little quieter, more inward. I found myself writing more, not in a dramatic way, no grand novel or memoir, just daily thoughts, letters I never sent, sentences I wanted to speak out loud, but never did. I wrote to Mom. I wrote to myself at age 17. I even wrote a letter addressed to the woman who sat beside the general, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the back of my journal. Some days, I wondered what he was doing. The general. We hadn't spoken since his visit. No letters, no follow-ups. But it didn't feel like he was gone. Just quiet. The way certain people are always with you even when they leave. He had given me something I didn't know how to ask for recognition, and he asked for nothing in return. That kind of gift doesn't disappear. It settles into the bones of your life. Just before Christmas, I received a small package, no return address, just a stamp from a neighboring town and my name, handwritten, on the front. Inside was a book, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. I hadn't read it in years. Tucked inside the cover was a card. For the woman who walks quietly but shakes the ground. I saw you once, and that was enough. an old soldier. I sat at the kitchen table, snow falling outside the window, tears streaming down my face. I opened to a page he had dog-eared. I am larger, better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness. That night, I lit a candle and read aloud to myself, not because anyone was listening, but because I wanted to hear the sound of my own voice. It had changed. Somehow. Stronger. Deeper. More grounded. I thought about how many years I had spent making myself smaller, apologizing for my softness, apologizing for being emotional, apologizing for leaving, and worse, for not returning the way they wanted. But I wasn't sorry anymore. Not for any of it. Every step away from them had been a step toward myself. On Christmas morning, I woke up early, made a cup of coffee, and bundled up in my thickest sweater. I drove to Thomas's house not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. He was surprised to see me, standing there on his porch with a tin of lavender shortbread in one hand and a photo album tucked under my arm. "Well," he said with a grin, "either you've come to rob me or you've come to forgive me." I raised an eyebrow. "Depends on how good your coffee is." He stepped aside and let me in. His house. Once a place I'd felt out of place in, now felt normal, comfortable, like we'd grown into something more equal. He brewed the coffee. I placed the photo album on the kitchen table. Inside were pictures of Mom, of us as children, of her garden, and the notes she'd scribbled in the margins of old seed packets. Thomas flipped through the pages slowly. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for keeping her alive in this way." I shrugged. "It's just pictures." "No," he said, looking at me. "It's memory. It's proof that someone stayed." That word again. Stayed. After lunch, Lily joined us with her husband. We played cards like we used to, laughed over stories I thought were long buried. No one made jokes at my expense. No one overlooked me. For once, I wasn't just the sister who disappeared. I was Clara, present, whole, seen. Before I left, Thomas walked me to my car. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. "I wrote this weeks ago," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't know when to give it to you." Inside was a short letter, honest, unpolished, a mixture of guilt, gratitude, and finally respect. He ended it with something that caught me off guard. "You always had the heart, and you were always stronger than me. I see that now." I didn't speak. I just hugged him. A long, firm, real hug. And that was enough. New Year's came with snowstorms and silence. I spent the night at home, no party, no celebration. I didn't feel the need to mark the passage of time with noise. Instead, I sat by the window, candle lit, journal open, lavender tea steaming in my hands. I wrote to the quiet ones. You do not need to shout to be heard. You do not need applause to matter. Your staying power, your listening, your grace. These are not weaknesses. They are the ground the world forgets it stands on. And now, dear listener, I pass that truth to you. If you have ever felt overlooked, if your heart has been mocked, or your kindness mistaken for weakness, if you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt invisible, let this story remind you you are not small, you are not forgotten, and you are not alone. You carry a quiet strength the world desperately needs, the kind that does not ask for attention, but gives it. The kind that does not chase the spotlight, but builds the foundation beneath it. You stayed. That counts more than you know. Have you ever been the quiet one in your family, your group, your world, but found your strength in stillness? If this story speaks to you, I invite you to leave a comment. Not for me, But for someone else who might be scrolling and looking for a sign that they matter, your voice might be the one that saves them. Thank you for listening.